Hi guys, welcome back to my channel and to today's video where I'm going to be talking to you about the process and a few techniques and everything of creating this great tit on this blossom branch. Before we get into it, I do just want to mention that the reference photo for this was actually one that I composed myself from two references which were taken from Pixabay, and if you do want to follow along with the full tutorial and gain access to that composed reference that I created as well as an explanation video of how I actually did that, pop on over to Patreon. The whole lot of it is over there. But let's get into this one here. So I started with the bird itself. I wanted to start with the bird because it's sitting over the top of this blossom, so it's got blossom behind it and it's got blossom in front. So the tail and everything is sitting on top of the blossom that is behind the bird. So it really made sense to kind of add in all of the bird first and then tackle all of that blossom in one go. So I started off with some of the most important and key aspects of the bird, which was the eye and the beak. These, as you can see, in comparison to like my pencil tip and my fingers, these were very, very small sections. They needed a really sharp pencil. That's key for getting in those really tiny details. So if you're working on something similar or you want to follow along with this and you're wondering how on earth you get like such tiny details and manage to pack detail in there, it's with using a super sharp pencil. The pencil sharpener that I use is a swordfish icon. I get asked this all the time. It's a mechanical pencil sharpener and that's the one that I have used for this tutorial, and you can see just how nice and sharp all of the points on my pencils are. So if you're wanting one to get really nice sharp points, get that one. But you can see for the dark parts of the bird, I've added down a really nice blue base. So I've actually used an Indanthrene blue pencil, and then on top of that I'm going in with some dark indigo because I'm layering those blue colours together to get a really nice dark blue tone. And I've also layered on top of that some dark sepia. Layering dark sepia, and I've also used some walnut brown as well just to try and create those darker tones, and layering those on top of one another will create some really super rich dark areas. So the reason that I've put that blue on the underneath is so that we can get that rich dark colour, but also you've got some of that blue showing through where it's creating a little bit of a highlight on the top of his head there. And the blue really helps to convey the idea that there is a highlight there. So that's why I've added blue as a base. It's just really nice to use for darker tones as well. For the kind of greeny yellow blue section just before his wings on the back of his neck here, I've used some yellow pencils and then I've combined them with green, and then again layered in some of those blue tones that are reflected in the head there as well. The blue tones I've used to kind of create the darker tone of that green, and of course you guys probably know that if you layer yellow and blue together you get green, and I didn't pick out too many dark green colours for this particular tutorial because I wanted to keep the colour list really nice and simple. So I've layered the blue and the yellow together to create my own kind of variety of green tones. Then it's time to fill in all of the wings, and I'm using a base colour of some warm grey 1, and then I'm going in and adding in all of the darker elements of the wings here. I'm using some dark indigo again because I use the dark indigo and the Indanthrene blue for the head, so I'm following through the same process and using the blue tones to sketch out a lot of the shadow areas. And I also like to use blue tones to do this as well because I find that they work really well in kind of any kind of shadow colour. So I'm using some of the dark indigo and some Indanthrene blue and then darkening up the darkest areas by going over the top with some walnut brown, so combining that blue and that brown together to create a nice dark tone. And I'm also using a nice sharp dark sepia pencil as well. Key here as well is using that sharp point, and you can see that I've kind of blended over some lighter colour in between those darker areas of the wing. You can see that there's obviously not too much going on in that little wing section where I've added all of those little dark lines, and that's because the wings were reflecting quite a lot of light, so there's quite a lot of light patches, and I found that it had a really nice effect if I just added in those lines and then added in a tiny little bit of a base layer to just fill in the paper white. It gave a really nice effect. So sometimes you don't need to add in a bunch of layers to get the effect that you're after. You can just add in a few simple layers and you can create a really awesome effect, as you can see on the wing here. but some people do like to add a lot of layers, but that just wasn't necessary here, and I didn't want to overcomplicate things if it wasn't entirely necessary. For the chest of the bird, I'm just using some simple light colours, so I'm using some ivory, and I'm also using a Caran d'Ache luminance pencil. I believe it's the brown ochre 10%, which is a really nice kind of pale yellow colour. I would use a cream in the Polychromos, but the brown ochre 10% in the luminance, it just has a little bit more of like a kind of nutty kind of colour. That's the only way I can think of to describe it, whereas the cream is just a little bit too yellow. So I've used that to help to blend and add a little bit of tone and texture into the chest, as well as a variety of different brown pencils. I've used some walnut brown, and then I've used some warm grey 4, a little bit of blue and a few greens through there as well to add a little bit of texture. I've mainly kept it to using a little bit of a shading motion. I did a few lines here and there where I saw that there was a little bit of definition and a few kind of shadows that you could see where the feathers were parted a little bit. The bird portion for this was actually the most simple. The thing that took the longest time were the blossoms and the branch. You can see I'm kind of adding in little sections of the branch, so the way that I'm doing that is outlining the actual outer section of the branch, and then I'm going to go through and fill that in with a variety of browns, so you see some greys as well to create the tone of the branch. A little bit of sanguine on top of that grey there, it creates almost a Van Dyke brown kind of colour without having to pick that out, and I find that when you do layer colours like this, you get a much better effect rather than using like a straight colour from the box, if that makes sense. So I've kind of tried to create a few of my own colours by layering some greys and some browns and then blending them all together. The green leaves in between some of these blossoms here were created using the same green tones that I had picked out for the Great Tit and the same yellow. So the yellow that I've used is a cadmium yellow, which I find really works well for adding in the lighter elements of leaves, and I've also used some May green and some permanent green as well. So those are the ones that I'm layering onto the leaves now, and you can see I'm using the kind of lighter green colour, so the May green, for the lighter areas of the leaf, and then I'm using the darker green for the edges and for adding in any kind of shadows around the veins of the leaves and that kind of thing. I'm also doing the same kind of thing for the little stalks of the blossoms as well, and I'm also adding in a little bit of shading onto that with some walnut brown, so kind of adding in onto the stalks of the blossoms the colours that are going on in the branch as well. As I said, the main kind of thing that was going on with this, and the thing that took the longest time, were the blossoms themselves. And because they're really delicate and really light in colour, they don't require too many colours, but they do require a lot of attention and a little bit of patience and layering, because it can be quite difficult to actually get the colours and the tones correct in there. For the palest ones, which is one of these ones that I'm working on now, I just used some warm grey 1, and then I used some warm grey 2 and a firmer pressure on the warm grey 1 pencil to add in any shadows. I've also used some of the burnt sienna 10%, which is this really dusky pink colour from the luminance range. This works really well for getting that kind of pinky tone into the petals, and a few other of the blossoms will have a little bit more of that pinky tone, so you'll see it used in a little bit more kind of force. I'm just using it lightly on these few blossoms here, but we will go through and use it a little bit more liberally on some of the other blossoms. For the middles of these, I just created, as you can see what I'm doing here, is just kind of using the sanguine pencil, and I'm creating a really kind of orangey, almost blended out middle, and then I'm using the sharp point of the pencil here to create the little bits of the pollen where they've got really long bits. I'm not sure what the actual components of the flower are called, but you've got the like long kind of stalky bits coming out of the middle with the pollen bits on. So I've used the sharp point of my pencil to really get those in, and when I notice that the pencil's getting a little bit blunt, I'm going through and just sharpening that so I can get some really nice crisp round details that conveys that the blossoms have these kind of really long flowy looking bits of orange floating through them. So you can see on these blossoms here, I'm using a little bit more of the burnt sienna 10%, and I'm using a little bit more of a firmer pressure. And to get a nice smooth surface on the blossoms as well, I'm using the white pencil, which is the Holbein Soft White, to smooth everything out. The white pencil also dilutes a lot of the colour, so it allows me to build up and go back in and add a little bit more pressure and really build up the layers of the blossoms, because I find that even though the colours, you're not adding too many colours, you still need a few layers in order for it actually to look like something. So by adding in a little bit of a white and blending out and then going back in and reapplying a little bit of yellow, we're adding to the layers and just adding a little bit of depth into each of these little flowers as well. This set of blossoms that are above the Great Tit here, these ones are a lot paler in colour compared to the ones down the bottom. I'm adding in a lot of cold grey one into these as well, because there is a very, very slight blue tone as well as that pink tone. So you've got cold and warm colours kind of competing against one another here. And it was a little bit difficult to try and get the balance between those particular areas. But I felt like I did a really good job, and the outcome, especially the kind of blossoms down here, they get better as they go along because I'm getting more confident with drawing the blossoms. But the ones at the top aren't bad, but I do like the ones down the bottom here because I'm really getting into the swing of it and knowing exactly what I'm doing. So you can see that I'm using the grey as the base. I'm using the same grey pencil to add in the darker areas, but using a really firm pressure in order to get a slightly darker tone from that colour. And as you can see here, I'm just kind of layering down a really light layer. You can barely see it on the camera. Just adding in a very light tone with the greys, going in with a darker colour or a firmer pressure on the same colour, and then going in with a darker colour. I've also gone in with some of the more shadowy colours, so some of the browns to go around the outside of the petals, and then kind of tried to blend them in a little bit by using those lighter colours to do a little bit of blending, so it's not just like a stark outline of the petals, so it's really nice and blurred and blended. For the rest of the blossoms, I'm just kind of following the same process. I'm just layering all of the different greys, adding in some pink, making sure that I'm getting all of the contrast right. So I'm constantly re-evaluating against the reference photo that I'm using for the blossoms here and making sure that I'm getting them in right. One thing that you do have to pay attention to when you are drawing flowers is the light direction, because you can't have one flower with one particular light direction. The shadows are kind of like all down the bottom of the flower, and then the next flower you're putting the shadows at the top. It just won't look right, unless obviously the flowers are at different height positions. Then it would kind of make sense to have those different shadow positions. But where you have a cluster of blossoms or flowers like this, you want to make sure that you're adding the shadows in the same place or the same places in each of the flowers. So a lot of the shadows here were kind of pointing towards the bottom right hand corner, so I had to make sure that I was shading all of the bottom right hands of the blossoms with a little bit of a firmer pressure or a few darker colours in order to convey that there was shadow. So the light direction was coming from the top left and it was beaming down and coming down towards the bottom right. So I'm just making sure that all of the shadows are kind of in a similar position on the flowers so that they all make sense when they're bunched together. So I'm just following that same process, just adding in the flowers one by one, adding in all of those little delicate orange sections and using the walnut brown to add in the very, very darkest middle section into the very, very middle of the flower. And you can see as you start to get more of them and they start to form, it looks more like blossom. Now they're getting all of their form and all of their shadowing. I'm using a lot of blue down here as well, because these also do have like a little bit more of a blue tone. So I'm using some of the Indentrine blue, which I used on the Great Tit. So I'm making sure that I'm using the same colours throughout the bird and the blossom as well, so that we have a really nice cohesive colour scheme going throughout the piece. But yeah, they're just really starting to look like blossoms and they're starting to really form together, and I was really quite happy with how this piece actually turned out. I wasn't looking forward to doing the blossoms to begin with because they were super bright and light textures on white paper like this is often very hard. But I find that you really have to kind of over exaggerate some of the shadows and everything in order to get a really nice form on a lighter subject like this, whether it's blossoms like this or a white dog or anything like that. But anyway, that's pretty much it for this short tutorial. I really hope that you enjoyed it, and if you do want to follow along with the full piece, make sure that you pop on over to Patreon. The link is in the description below, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Bye!